Guten Abend. Hello, and a very warm welcome to this edition of Totally Glocally, a discussion series focusing on societal issues reflecting the interaction between the global and the local. Today's event on defending academic freedom is brought to you by the Institut für Auslandsbeziehungen, IFA, in cooperation with the Institut Français, Stuttgart, and the city of Stuttgart, which, of course, is capital of the state of Baden-Württemberg. I'm Melinda Crane, a U.S. educated lawyer and political economist and former chief political correspondent at Deutsche Welle Television. It is my great pleasure to accompany you as moderator. No matter what time zone you're joining us from, we're very glad to have you with us. Und falls Sie aus Deutschland zugeschaltet sind und sich eine Übersetzung wünschen, klicken Sie bitte auf die Ikone unten in diesem Streaming-Fenster und Sie bekommen dann eine Übersetzung ins Deutsch. I think you hardly need a reminder, dear guests, that targeted action is restricting academic freedom and limiting the scope of scientific research at universities that play a vital role in the development and dissemination of knowledge worldwide. The recent experiences of leading U.S. institutions have made headlines and sparked opposition from academicians and civil society. What will it take for their efforts for that opposition to succeed? And how well protected is academic freedom within EU countries? Those are two of the key questions that we'll be exploring over the next 75 minutes in words of greeting on behalf of our hosts and with an outstanding panel of leading scholars. I'd like to take this opportunity to greet all of our speakers, whom I will introduce in more detail a little bit later on. We are also very eager to hear from all of you, dear audience. You can pose your questions at any time using the chat window on this live stream, and I'll bring them in later on during our panel. And before we begin, I would also like to note that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded to IFA's YouTube channel. Now, we begin with opening remarks from the French Consul General in Stuttgart. Gaël de Maisonneuve, Excellence, vous avez la parole.
Well, thank you very much, dear Melinda. It's a great pleasure for me, live from Institut Français in Stuttgart, to greet on behalf of the co-organizer the audience online. I must say I haven't done that kind of online project since COVID times, and it's a little bit of work up to get it working, but I'm really, really delighted with my colleague Joanne Mazot-Schmidt, who at the Institut Français has worked very closely with IFA. IFA is a federal institution in Stuttgart, and we're really, really happy to collaborate with them. And naturally, the city of Stuttgart is a very big partner, in particular about defending the academic freedom and the political rights. As some of you know, the rates are quite worrying. In 2006, there were about 1 in 2 citizens in the world living in a state of academic freedom. It seems that now the rate is down to 1 out of 3. So it's really worrying. And we're really happy in France, in Germany, to be working with this Totally Glocally project to defend academic freedom. That's really a priority for both our countries in the frame of Europe. And so we're really glad that among the panelists, Beatty Riedl will be participating from 2026 at Sciences Po Paris about the Choose Europe for Science program. And we're very happy that on the French side, we've launched a similar initiative called Choose France for Science. We're also very happy, for me personally, to be in Baden-Württemberg in Germany, where the priority is really strong. And Baden-Württemberg started 2 months ago, Global Partnership for Science. We're also very happy because Ned Hall, from Harvard, is working with the University of Heidelberg on this project. Baden-Württemberg is a very dynamic land for political debating. There are about 45 leading academic institutions. That's quite a lot. And the panel that has been reunited for this evening with also Beatty Riedl from Sciences Po Bordeaux and Maria Sibylla from Ruhr Bochum is really striking. I will now leave the floor back to you, Melinda. I will be following from my colleague Joanne's office the proceedings, but I'm really, really happy. And I thank again the city of Stuttgart and IFA for this wonderful Glocally program. Merci beaucoup et bonne soirée.
Merci à vous, and many thanks to you, Consul General Maisonneuve, for those messages, and we will be picking up on them in our high-level panel. And you've already given us a glimpse of our very honorable participants. It's now my pleasure to welcome them in more detail, starting with Professor Marie-Sibylle Lotter. She is Professor of Philosophy at the Ruhr University in Bochum. She's also a founding member of Germany's Netzwerk Wissenschaftsfreiheit, in English, the Academic Freedom Network. Amongst her latest works is the anthology Problems of the Culture of Debate in Democracy and Science, which she edited. Welcome to you, Professor Lotter. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
It's also a great pleasure to welcome Professor Edward J. Hall. He holds the Norman E. Vullier Chair in Philosophy at Harvard University, and he's co-president of Harvard's Council on Academic Freedom. He has published extensively on issues relating to causality and the philosophy of science. Ned Hall, great that you can be here with us.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. We're grateful for the invitation.
And I'm pleased to welcome Professor Rachel Beatty Riedl. She is Peggy J. Koenig 78 Director of the Center on Global Democracy at Cornell University's Brooks School of Public Policy. And she's Professor of Political Science in Cornell's Department of Government. She's currently affiliated with Sciences Po Bordeaux, and as we heard from the Consul General, she will join Sciences Po Paris for the spring 2026 semester as part of the Choose Europe for Science funding program. So great that you can be with us, Professor Riedl.
Such a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you.
Now, all three of you are active in the effort to preserve and protect academic freedom. So I'd like to ask you to get us started with brief opening assessments of where that effort stands today in the United States, as well as in Europe and beyond, if you like. How grave is the threat to the knowledge ecosystem, and to what extent do attacks on the independence of scientific research reflect a broader political agenda? Those are some of the key questions that it would be great to hear your opinion of, and also that we will return to in the discussion. And Professor Hall, Harvard has very much been at the eye of the storm in the US, so I'll ask you to get us started. And if you would, please share some concrete examples of what you are seeing at Harvard and which fields are most under attack.
Yeah, if it's okay, Melinda, I'll come back to those questions. I wanted to start by offering some very sort of broad framing remarks, because I think that in thinking about threats to academic freedom and how to counter them, it is a good idea to begin by being as clear as possible about what academic freedom is meant to protect. And in thinking about that question, it's a good idea to be as clear as possible about what the core mission of university is. Because part of, I think, the problem in the United States is both internal to academia and in the broader public, there's been a increasing unclarity about what that mission is. I'll present one vision of that mission, or rather, as we'll see, missions. And I should say it's this vision that animated the creation of Harvard's Council on Academic Freedom, which predated the threats from Trump. So as we see it, a university has two great obligations to society. One is to foster the discovery and dissemination of knowledge and understanding. The other is to prepare students for lives of meaning, purpose, and service. Not necessarily for their careers, but for lives of meaning, purpose, and service. To discharge the first obligation, a university must ensure, this is critical, that the work of its scholars receives robust, informed, and impartial appraisal that applies the best truth-seeking standards appropriate to their discipline, without pressure to bow to the opinions of the state, or a corporation, or a university administrator, or those, sometimes including students, who express feelings of outrage or harm at the ideas they dislike. So when it comes to the university's research mission, I think academic freedom exists to enable, you could put it, discovery without fetters. For that reason, a university must steadfastly advance academic freedom and resist all manner of encroachment upon it. It must operate with full transparency as to sources of funding, push back against attempts to use state power to curtail academic freedom, which Harvard is in the thick of doing right now, and when necessary, issue firm reminders that extending the frontiers of knowledge inevitably risks offense, something that my institution has not been good at doing internally in the last 10 or so years, but I can come back to that. To discharge the second obligation, which focuses on the teaching mission, a university needs to train its students and its teachers to engage across disagreement. This is absolutely central. Learning how to treat with intellectual seriousness and honesty the wide range of ideas and perspectives that live within the diverse community we house. We all suffer from blind spots and a dangerous, if very, very natural resistance to considering the full range of what is possible, especially when the question before us is at all charged. A university education ought to target that resistance and develop in students and in faculty the habits of mind crucial to a self-governing people. In our teaching, for that reason, academic freedom exists first and foremost to oppose the oppression and poverty of ignorance. So for that reason, I think a university must safeguard two essential and quite distinct freedoms. Each could be thought of as a form of freedom of speech. Each member of the academic freedom should be free from fear of reprisal for the positions they defend, the questions they ask, the ideas they entertain. We should all welcome thoughtful critique and be able to engage with each other, confident that neither attacks on our character nor the threat of institutional sanction, in our case, most notably from the federal government, will take its place. Second, every member of our community should enjoy full standing to speak and be heard, regardless of background or social position. It's not enough that we refrain from threatening those whose ideas we don't like. We also have a moral duty to listen and to approach disagreement in a spirit of genuine curiosity, motivated by the desire to learn from each other and open to the possibility that any of us at any time might be wrong. And I will say, just to close, with respect to that second aim of that openness to listening, this is something where internally we have faced serious problems, certainly at Harvard and at other institutions of higher education. And one of, I think, the serious threats that we see coming from the Trump administration have to some extent been enabled by us dropping the ball internally and allowing a kind of vision or narrative to take hold in the public consciousness that universities are not a place where students are taught to know how to inquire, in an open, curiosity-driven way, but rather are places where they're indoctrinated. This is not true, but we have done far too little to combat that narrative. So I'll close there.
Thank you very much. And thank you also for the introspective side of that. And we will come back to that a little bit later on. Professor Riedl, if I could come to you now, you are well acquainted with threats to academic freedom, both in the US and also internationally, and you took part in an American Political Science Association task force on global attacks on higher education in the context of democratic backsliding. So perhaps you could include a comparative picture in your introductory thoughts.
Wonderful. Absolutely. I'm so glad to be a part of this conversation and to share what's happening around the world as a part of a broader autocratic playbook and attacks on democracy executed by elected governments, and to put into picture then how the United States is fitting into this playbook. So in thinking about the reasons and the processes or the strategies by which elected governments attack academic freedom, attack universities, and attack the very basis of scientific knowledge production, from a global perspective, we understand that these types of attacks are a part of a more general strategy by which elected presidents and ruling parties engage in a wide range of critiques and silencing of would-be other ways of thinking about the world. And they do so with a variety of different narratives, that universities are too much X or not enough Y. And they do so with these kind of narratives about ideological positioning. But when we look globally across the world, we see, in fact, that these positions really depend upon the types of social polarization that are happening in society, whether elected presidents are trying to exacerbate and create divisions in society, and therefore provide a pretext for their own rule breaking and executive overreach. So the underlying truth with these processes of attacking academic freedom and limiting universities' role in a democratic society is that the governments themselves are bent on eroding checks on their power, and they're driven to crush independent and authoritative institutions that can get in their way. Universities are one such crucial institution in society. So therefore, government attacks on universities are very familiar to us who study democratic erosion across the world. I'm just going to give you a few brief examples to begin a kind of positioning of how this takes place and the strategies that are used. In Turkey, under President Erdogan, the attacks on universities began subtly by cracking down on speech that criticized the government. Then, in a sequence, he began to reduce the autonomy of universities in their own self-rule and increase police presence, coercive presence, on campus. In response to mounting pressures from society and from military leaders, he purged academia of so-called critics and accused them of links to terrorist organizations. He also tightened controls by replacing university elected leaders and institutionally selected presidents and deans with government loyalists and government appointed administrative leaders. Now let me move to Hungary. You'll start to see some parallels and patterns. Viktor Orban in Hungary also targeted academic institutions that challenged his ethno-nationalist agenda. In particular, we know the well-known case of the Central European University, which was announced that his government was forcing the school out of the country by no longer allowing the university to be accredited in teaching students and giving degree programs. He then restructured public universities, so going well beyond the CEU, transferring their control to government-aligned foundations and allowing only those friendly to the government to dominate decision-making and funding. Certain types of academic programs were banned, and university curricula were reshaped to fit this nationalist, this ethno-nationalist agenda and conservative ideology. In Poland, we see a similar attack on universities under the PiS government through ideological interference around topics related to culture, history, and identity politics. Here, in particular, the 2018 law on higher education and science reform centralized academic governance in Poland, giving more power to university presidents and councils. Opponents said that this law opened the door to government efforts to curb academic freedom, exert political influence, and control higher education's funding and decision-making. So we see here, and in many other countries, in Mexico, etc., we see these ways of controlling university administration, of targeting particular types of curriculum, particularly focusing on nationalist histories, on data production. And when we look now in the United States, we see the ways in which the Trump administration is dusting off this playbook and has undertaken a barrage of measures to restrict academic freedom. It's threatened to severely decrease and cut off university funding, to steeply increase taxes on university endowments, and to exert political control over the university accreditation process, as well as potentially admissions and hiring. So in this way, we can see that these are parts of a broader strategy driven to weaken institutions that offer independent and authoritative sources of information.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Rachel Beatty Riedl, and we will come back again to several of those key points that you raised. I'll go now to Professor Lotter, and when you hear all of this, do you find yourself thanking your lucky stars that you're based in Germany and Western Europe, or would you say that here too academic freedom is endangered?
Well, it is, but not in the strong way, and in a very different way. Germany is regularly ranked among the countries with the strongest protection for academic freedom, and this is largely because our constitution grants academic freedom the status of a fundamental right. It shields research and teaching from state interference and obliges the state to respect the autonomy of scholarly inquiry. So many European countries, not only Hungary, but also England and France, do not have this kind of constitutional protection. But this legal guarantee is only one side of the story. academic freedom also has a lived cultural dimension. It depends on the culture of research, teaching, and debate in which open exchange, disagreement, and serious engagement with opposing views are not only tolerated but valued. And it is precisely here that the picture in Germany and in many other European democracies has become a little more complicated over the last decade. Today, we see threats to academic freedom coming from very different directions. And it is important to distinguish those coming from outside the universities, like we heard about in Turkey and in Hungary, from those emerging inside. In Europe, some threats are clearly state-driven. Hungary is the most dramatic recent example. But the institution as such is threatened, and the state exerts constant pressure, which scientists can never be sure of the future of their institutions. In Germany, however, the main challenges are rather internal. They arise from internal dynamics of highly moralized debates on, say, identity, justice, discrimination, vulnerability, and some other political topics, and the rapid cycles of outrage in social media. By this, I mean the tendency to translate scholars' assumptions and positions into some morally condemnable categories, such as anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, sexism, and many others. The pressures coming from that do not appear dramatic at first glance, for they rarely involve formal censorship. Also, they do not affect all disciplines and subjects. But still, a significant minority of academics experiences hostility from other scholars or students, hostility grounded in political or moral disagreement. And as a result, scholars avoid certain research topics. Invitations for lectures are withdrawn, controversial discussions are postponed, and some informal taboos about what may or what may not be researched have developed. For instance, pursuing a dissertation on so-called honor killings within certain migrant communities is widely seen as too risky. Students fear being labeled racist and endangering their careers, even when they themselves come from such communities. At the same time, universities have become much more concerned with their public image than earlier and more vulnerable to social media-driven controversies. Sometimes a single protest or online campaign is enough for an invited lecture to be cancelled. By the way, cancelling is not confined to one political side. For many years, the restrictions tended to affect mainly conservative positions, but now the very real and justified concern about anti-Semitic incidents has recently led universities to disinvite or not invite in the first place leftist speakers who are critical of Israeli policies. However, I think the main problem is not the cancelling of lectures. The current challenge goes deeper. It concerns what Ned Hall has talked about, the need for a scientific culture of debate in which different perspectives are welcomed as opportunities for learning and discussions, rather than treated as scandals. We need to relearn tolerance for research questions and viewpoints that do not fit our own political commitments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Sibylla Lotta, for those words. And I want to now try to tie together some of the things the three of you had said. And I'll go back to Ned Hall, if I may. We heard mention from both Professor Lotta and Professor Riedl of the link between targeting of universities and political polarization within the broader society. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the reaction of the broader population in the US to the kind of attacks we have seen, not only against Harvard, but also against other universities, and how that links up with rising mistrust in science generally, because the numbers do show a significant rise in mistrust in science in the US, but elsewhere as well, particularly since the COVID pandemic. And that also appears to correlate with a rising mistrust in institutions and elites. So maybe you can put some of this into context for us.
That's a complex set of issues. So I think in recent, one thing that I think has been very important is what happened during the COVID crisis, where I think many people, left, right, and center, felt frustrated at certain public health measures that, in retrospect, seemed like they may have done more harm than good. What I'm thinking specifically is school closures, especially during the first full academic year that we're in COVID. I've had colleagues who suggest that the distrust of expertise goes back further than that, and will trace it to the 2007-2008 financial crisis and the response to that crisis that, in the eyes of the public, seemed to let certain very sort of powerfully placed bad actors off the hook. So I think that, like, distrust in expertise is its own topic, and I think has a number of different sources in the United States. And I think my sense is that distrust of colleges and universities in particular has been swept up as part of that general distrust, but with the added twist that it has been very easy for people on the right, so Trump and people allied with Trump, to sell a narrative to the part of the electorate that's already kind of predisposed towards them, that colleges and universities are just bastions of left-wing elitism, training the next generation of young people to occupy positions of power from which they will look down and condescend to you, our voting members. I'm very interested in hearing what Professor Riedl has to say about this, though, because I suspect she has like a much richer perspective. But we see this locally in just the kind of way when we talk to, say, alums or even students about what the culture is that we want them to enter into here, in kind of expectations that we as faculty need to undo now. So just to make that a bit more concrete, one thing that we're finding on the ground is that students will come into our classrooms assuming that you as a professor, I as a professor, have an agenda. And that's relatively new. That was not the case when I started at Harvard 20 years ago. And we have to fight upstream against that pedagogically. We have to convince them that this is a different kind of intellectual space where, yes, I may have my own personal opinions, but they are irrelevant to the task before us as a classroom. And that, I think, is a relatively new challenge. It's kind of a reflection of the polarization you talked about into our sort of local community.
So Harvard has not yet come to a settlement with the Trump administration, but Professor Riedl Cornell has just a few weeks ago. It did come to a settlement. And the US Education Secretary at that time called it a victory for truth-seeking, that's a quote, rather than DEI ideology. How do you see it? And how would you, again, link this to what we just heard from Ned Hall?
Yep, it's an excellent question, and it ties into this broader strategy of the government to make the universities the target of increasing social polarization, and a polarization that paints other points of view or debates over ideas as the enemies. And so I think that this is really at the heart of the decreasing trust in universities and in science. It is indeed a question that is manufactured both from above and from below. It has real currents in society's needs, absolutely, the decreasing trust in universities and in scientific expertise, as Ned Hall was suggesting. that relate to different ways in which expertise has been used to the public good or been needed refinement and adaptation. But the increasing distrust in scientific expertise is also a strategy that is used to minimize critique, that's used to minimize the use of data and scientific knowledge to hold power to account, and it is used to skew the understanding of citizens in their ability to make informed decisions about their well-being. So yes, absolutely, universities have to address a growing crisis of affordability and access, and that's across all the host of the institutional space of higher education, from community colleges, private universities, public universities. Across this landscape, we need to do better across higher education to increase affordability and access, and to better integrate our knowledge into the well-being of society, to use knowledge and science to respond to the societal questions of our time. That's one of the reasons that I really love being at Cornell University, which is both a private Ivy League university. It's also a public land grant institution that has a dedication to using knowledge to advance the work of farmers and agriculturalists, of people in community. So that's just to say that we need to do more on that front.
May I ask
please.
you a very quick follow-up question in regard to the public-private issue that you just mentioned? One question that I hear a lot as an American based in Europe is why U.S. universities, especially these big private universities, failed to mount a robust collective action response. As I mentioned, Cornell has made a settlement. Some other universities have made a settlement. The same picture amongst law firms. They moved individually in different ways rather than trying to present a concerted front against the targeting. So how does that relate to the role of money in the U.S. university system?
Yeah.
I think many of us have been astonished to see how much public funding private universities were still receiving.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's exactly right. And these differences across the university sector of higher ed in the United States, in fact, has made collective solidarity, which is absolutely essential to continue for universities to continue to play their role in society and in democracy. That lack of collective solidarity in part stems from some of the differences in how universities and colleges are organized in the United States. So as you mentioned, we have public universities that are state funded. And so they may receive a lot of pressures from state governments as well as federal pressures. And those vary, of course, across our decentralized federal system. And then we have some universities that are religious institutions like Notre Dame University or Brigham Young University. And we have secular universities. So those also have different types of missions and mandates and relationship to federal law. And then we have a very different levels of funding across universities in terms of how well endowed they are and where they rely on resources from tuition, endowment, or from research funding. So any large major university in the United States, whether public or private, relies on government funding across the range of humanities, social sciences, and in particular, the hard sciences. So the large research innovations from public health to nuclear security to a Department of Defense to agriculture and food sovereignty, all of these real issues that relate to national goals are funded for research innovation through national grants. And so in that way, the difficulty in mounting a collective solidarity response to these kinds of attacks is in part because not all universities were equally targeted. Cornell and Harvard were both ones that received early targeting. And then universities have different relationships to federal funding. So in that way, universities have been put into different kinds of the tactic of targeting universities in a divide and conquer way has been a part of the difficulty in responding in solidarity.
Absolutely. Ned Hall, is that a finger going up
Yeah, just
to weigh
really,
in,
really for Professor for Rachel Riedl, if you think that in addition, universities have seen themselves in soft competition with each other, both for federal funding, for status, for the best students, for the number of Nobel prizes they receive, and so on. And if that's that's presented a barrier to thinking
Absolutely.
of ourselves as in it together. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
exactly right. And I would say that that is at the level of the kind of neoliberal zero-sum world
Hmm.
that we live in that is
Hmm.
tied to rankings, that's tied to grant funding, and that's tied to different measures of prestige, that has also made it difficult for us to cooperate and collaborate in terms of the best science. So this
Yeah.
is a
Hmm.
much broader issue about how we can do the best work in our role and our dedication to society.
Interestingly enough, I can say that as a lawyer, we've seen the same phenomenon amongst the law firms,
Hmm.
and it's very much related to the structure of the business of law in the United States. But leaving that aside, let me go to Professor Lotter now. Thank you very much, Professor Lotter, for patiently waiting out that topic. Let me ask you now, because a lot of the cutbacks that we've seen have actually affected particular areas of research, particular programs at some of the major universities, with the result that scientists and researchers, in some cases, have decided to leave these universities because they feel that they can no longer conduct their research freely. So let me ask you about recruitment programs in Europe to try to win over American scientists. Would you say that the US loss is becoming Europe's gain?
Well, I think it's very complicated. Europe is certainly offering funding, and I think the European Union has launched a €500 million campaign specifically to attract scientists and researchers whose work is undermined in the US, combining new grants with policy changing frames around academic freedom and inclusion. But I think the situation is very different in Europe, and it's not easy for US researchers just to come to Europe. Most times they use grants for several years and then go back. So I think it's less a brain drain that's to be expected than an exchange. That maybe now a lot of US researchers come for some time to Europe and look if this would be an opportunity for them. Uh, but it's a fact that European universities function very differently. We have a very high teaching load. The salaries are not up to the US salaries, at least not in the salaries in the elite institutions. And there is a language problem for settling. In European countries, you can teach in English, but if you really want to integrate, you have to learn the languages. And so I think it's not easy for many researchers who may think I would like to to change the country. It's still a step. Yeah. But of course, efforts are taken, and I think some countries in Europe, not all, so only the countries who can afford it will profit a bit from, uh, let's say, a rather small kind of brain drain.
I want to get Professor Riedl to talk a little bit about the
Mm,
program that you will be working
mm,
with at Sciences Po Paris. But first,
mm,
let me bring in Ned Hall, if I may, to briefly talk about the brain drain issue from the US academic perspective. So, Harvard has seen a
Hmm.
significant drop in international student
Hmm.
enrollment due
mm.
to the immigration visa targeting from the Trump administration. And I recently spoke to a medical school professor there who told me that he's now having trouble recruiting international talent for his lab. Is it too dramatic to apply the term brain drain to this phenomenon, or do you see the beginnings of a worrisome outflow? And if so, what consequences would you expect that to have?
I don't think it's too dramatic. Just to up the drama somewhat, we are seeing across the board cuts to admissions targets for graduate programs at Harvard. Um, Philosophy can weather these fine, but I'll just use us as an example because it's the one I know. We typically aim to admit 6 students into our graduate program per year. That's now for the next 2 years been reduced to 2, which is really too few to have a cohort. Now, that's philosophy can weather that kind of thing if it's a short-term problem. In the sciences, that's not so easy. No, you can find projects that really require an influx of talent to keep them going, just like wither on the vine. And I know that my colleagues in the sciences and in the med school are quite worried about not so much the loss of like people who are established elite researchers, though that may come, but for the reasons Professor Lauter said, it may not, they may be entrenched here. No, but they're very much worried about the kind of the production of the next generation of scientists. So I think that's quite a serious problem. Yeah.
Thank you. And now, Professor Riedl, if you would, please talk a little bit about what you will be doing at Sciences Po Paris with this Choose Europe for Science. Is this like the EU going out and trying to lure away US talent due to the opportunities presented by the Trump administration targeting?
I really see it in a much more collaborative way in the sense that Dr. Lotta was referring to as a way of strengthening transnational collaborative networks, which I think is a necessary approach. If we look at the kind of scholars at risk programs, for example, that have existed for decades in the United States that have funded scholars coming from other countries to the United States who were being targeted by their home governments, that was previously funded by the US government through 2024. These were programs that allowed people to come in who were being harassed for their academic work and or for their political positions, and they had to flee autocratic countries. Now, we see in the United States a very few number of people, but we did have the case recently of the Rutgers University professor, Dr. Mark Bray, who is a scholar of anti-fascism, a historian. And he recently fled to Spain after receiving death threats because of his work, because certain organizations were naming him on social media as being a kind of anti-fascist financier of the left-wing movement. He's, according to his own statements and media reporting, he's not a member of any organization. He's a scholar of anti-fascism. So we can see there the way in which the social media channels and the kind of polarization starts to shift whether scholars can do their work. And so in that case, particular types of movement, to other countries is necessary. And so in those emergency situations, these kinds of programs can be incredibly essential. But the vast majority of people will stay in their home country when they are part of a pro-democracy coalition, and they see their work as embedded in their home institution and their intellectual commitments. And for the very reasons Dr. Lotta referred to, it's very difficult to move across different types of educational institutional systems and different frameworks and different expectations and different hiring mechanisms to receive a permanent position in another university is a very difficult thing to do according to different types of system processes. So the key focus that I see going forward and something that I've committed actually my entire career as a scholar is about establishing transnational networks of scholarly expertise and knowledge exchange. And I see this as the way forward, both to advance different types of perspectives and to have that ideological and methodological diversity that we were saying is at the heart of the democratic mission of education and university research. That is more possible through transnational collaboration, and to be able to take up important questions that are prioritized in certain countries and certain regional organizations and maybe less prioritized in others. So, for example, to me, some of the EU Horizon funding is incredibly important in this moment because government and regional organization funding sets priorities. and can help spur along some kind of research. Now, American researchers can't be principal investigators. They can't be the leads on those grants, but they can be parts of those kinds of teams. And so structuring research agendas and funding support and priorities in ways that build solidarity and collaboration towards advancing science for the good of the society is what I see these programs as being about.
Thank you very much. I'd like to broaden the discussion a little bit to talk about what attacks on academic freedom mean in the broader political and societal context. And Professor Lotta, when you were talking about the differences between European and US academic cultures, I found myself thinking about Humboldt and Humboldt's idea of the link between teaching and research and the necessity of freedom for both. So give us, if you would, the nutshell version of the question of academic freedom from a philosophical perspective. What is it that's at stake here for society?
Well, I think there are epistemic and ethical aspects of this question. Academic freedom, on the one hand, is necessary for pursuing truth, for getting for finding a consent or a compromise by discussing political, economical, or other important matters without being blocked by political polarization. So I think academic freedom is very important as a kind of ideal for democratic discussion also. If people, which happens in Germany now also, not to the extent like in the US, but it happens, if people think that in reality what goes on in the university, at least in some subjects, is only politicized, it is kind of party business, we lose the foundation for a debate in which different parties can combine to search for truth, to search for the best solution of concrete problems. And this needs a certain ethics also. It needs a certain commitment to listen to the other party, to entertain a certain benevolent curiosity for different standpoints, and to refrain from a quick moralization of issues which appear kind of strange to you. Yeah? And academic freedom needs a lot of cultural effort to put in the ways we engage with each other. That's the main problem right now in Germany. Everybody accepts this theoretically, but if you ask people within the academic society and outside, they only see the problem with the other political side. So most academics think there is no problem within the academic area, but we are threatened by the AfD, the very right-wing political party. And a lot of the conservatives think the problem only is within a sort of crazy progressivism within the academic community. And the liberals who find it normal to discuss with both sides in a benevolent fashion are minority right now. And I find this kind of threatening.
Professor Hall, you're welcome to comment on the same question if you like, but I would like to also take a look at another dimension of this. And I would quote to this end Harvard professor emeritus Joseph Nye. He was not a philosopher, but he was a professor in the political science department at Harvard, who warned already during the first Trump administration that abandoning soft power, including the attractions of strong independent institutions of higher learning, would weaken America's capacity and long-term credibility in the world and empower its rivals. So, in other words, not only an internal dimension, but also an external dimension to this.
Yeah, I think that's right. If it's all right, just like to add something to what Professor Lauter said, that I think the process of producing knowledge is often left invisible to people who are not in scholarly communities, and that process prioritizes setting up inquiry well. It's not enough to just end up at the right answer. You have to get there by the right sort of steps or procedure. And crucial to that is setting up inquiry where you do not constrain the space of possible answers at the outset, particularly because of fears of external political pressures or the kinds of internal pressures that Professor Lauter was pointing out earlier. And I think we often, we in the academy do not do enough to make it clear to the broader public, let alone our students, how much it requires a community who embrace certain core intellectual virtues, how essential that is to create the conditions for the kind of inquiry that can produce knowledge in the first place. And maybe that's a good lead into your question about soft power. I think, I mean, I do not feel like I'm a good enough political scientist to issue firm predictions, but I think that the kind, if the kind of unchecked attacks or assaults on these to go back to Rachel Riedl's way of putting it, these kind of independent sources of epistemic authority that are colleges and universities, to the extent that succeeds, it's not just going to damage us internally, but it's going to the United States, for example, will lose its position as it's in the eyes of the broader world community as a place where top quality scientific research happens. And I can't see anything but downside to that. I will add internally, we'll lose our ability to help shape public debate in sensible fashion. So as a concrete example of that, I know many economists worry about the erosion of standards at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, that's a source of critical information about the economy that academics use in order to draw important conclusions or make policy recommendations that, of course, people in the government use. And there are connections between, the pipeline to working in that bureau is the appropriate kind of academic credential. So there's a concrete example of a place where a certain kind of knowledge that up to now has been trusted and that has played a really important role in policymaking and governments more broadly is under threat.
Could I jump in on that as well, just
Yes.
to add to the conversation? I couldn't agree more with what my colleagues have just said. And I wanted to just add 2 points. And one is that the fight for academic freedom is no different from, and needs to be tied more clearly, I think, by us within universities to a broader question about freedom of information and expression for every member of society, for liberty, for justice, for transparency, and for accountability. And this relates to workplace conditions for every laborer. At the end of the day, we are seeking to protect workplace conditions that allow us to produce our best work. So academic freedom is not something separate and special and elitist. It is a workplace condition that allows us to contribute to knowledge and science for society. And so I think it's about at the heart of workers' rights and accountability and data being produced. And the second thing I just wanted to highlight is that so often I think that the debate about ideological diversity on campuses is also often shaped for specific purposes as mapping on exactly to existing polarized partisan positions within society. But within academia, what's interesting and what's important for exactly what Ned Hall was suggesting is necessary for this kind of diverse epistemic community is that we have heterodoxy in approaches, in methodologies, in perspective taking, and we can debate ideas that our disciplines might think are new or innovative or questionable. But that kind of diversity does not map onto a kind of partisan diversity that's found in any particular country. For example, I study authoritarian parties. And it's important for us to understand the mechanisms by which authoritarianism happens in society. I don't need to be normatively or partisan authoritarian in order to contribute to that knowledge base. So I think there's a really important distinction about how we talk about what diversity in our research looks like.
I just want to echo that super quickly because we are seeing debates on our campus right now about the need for greater viewpoint diversity, and the ambiguity, Rachel, that you just put your finger on is like shows up again and again there, like unclarity about that. I think that's really important.
I have a couple of audience questions coming in, and I'd like to get us now to shift our focus to talk a little bit more about solutions and approaches to dealing with the problem all of you have described so vividly. But one of these questions does relate to the actual discussion of what it is that the definition of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about academic freedom. You mentioned this at the outset of your remarks, Ned Hall, but let me ask you to just very succinctly address this question from Axel Sprenger. And he says, what exactly does academic freedom mean in this discussion? Is it the freedom to choose your own field of research and research questions, or the freedom to approach research questions using your own approach to discuss, interpret, and publish the results? Which is in greater danger?
I would have thought it was neither of those. I think it's important that students have freedom to choose whatever path they want. I don't think of that as academic freedom. That doesn't mean it's not important. And if someone wanted to extend the use of the term to cover that kind of freedom of choice, that's fine. I think once you are in a scholarly community, you are not free to just say whatever you want, advancing your own methodological standards. You are subject to the constraints imposed by the best scholarly standards of your discipline. And it's not a given that those will be in healthy shape. Like disciplines, like we know from like close historical study of historical examples, that disciplines can, as it were, go bad in various ways. So I don't mean to be Pollyannish about that. But academic freedom does not mean absence of constraint in research. It means the constraints come from a particular source, namely the other experts who are your peers in a given field and in neighboring fields. That's the way I see that part of it.
Thank you very much. And then I have a question here from the head of public engagement and impact at the Museum für Naturkunde in Berlin, so the Museum of Natural History in Berlin. And he says, despite declining public trust overall, research and higher education do remain among the most trusted sectors. Yet, in both Germany and the UK, they are rarely publicly advocated for. Many people feel disconnected from research and teaching. And then he goes on to ask, how can we expect political support when we rank so low in the priorities of those who elect politicians? And how can we encourage researchers and educators to engage productively and safely with people whose perspectives differ from their own? Who would like to address that question?
I'm happy to begin, and then I welcome additional comments. But I agree completely that universities need to more frequently and more precisely articulate their role in society. And so I think that it is true that our kind of the sense of science and expertise is being put into question. Again, I think that that's in part due to our politicized media information ecosystem and different types of strategies of weakening the role of science and expertise in society. But I think that political support for universities and higher education is more generally wrapped up within questions of social mobility. And these are at the heart of why people might feel that they want different types of politicians and different types of governance, that we have to address our role of universities contributing to social mobility and and the ability of our country, of our people to thrive. And to that end, I think, part of the response to some of these attacks has been a much more concerted campaign to demonstrate how our research and innovation contribute to those ends, to economic mobility and social mobility, to training, to innovation in healthcare, in food production, and etc. Ways in which specific research, development, and design that comes out of laboratories and the work that we do on campuses translates into public goods. And I think that that is something that we know within the industry, but needs more of a narrative and storytelling that connects to political pressure to support the work that universities do.
And let me perhaps also bring in Professor Lotta on this, particularly on this second question that was posed. How can we encourage researchers and educators to engage productively and safely with people whose perspectives differ? Because I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the reason for the creation of the German Netzwerk Wissenschaftsfreiheit. As I understand it, cancel culture issues were one reason for that. The sense that academic freedom was being limited by mandates related to creating safe zones and so on. Can you talk a little bit about that in this context?
Yeah. Um, it was felt, I mean, the founding of the Netzwerk Wissenschaftsfreiheit started in 22, no, in 20, and this was the at the same time as the Corona, as a Corona politics had a very heavy influence on teaching, and schools were closed, universities were closed for some time, and the feeling was the topic of safety and vulnerability has become the all-encompassing topic, which kind of puts everything else in the background. And on the one hand, there were the health dangers, and on the other hand, in the universities, spread a new kind of, let's say, vulnerability discourse. The concepts of vulnerability, especially in moral and political areas, were stretched so far that it appeared that to hear certain lectures, to be confronted with certain positions is a danger for your health if you belong to a vulnerable group. Yeah? So the concept of harm, of avoiding harm, was used to restrict the discussions of certain positions. And I found this a very problematic development, and so we grounded a network of scientists who try to put academic freedom more in the foreground, and just to get some attention for the value of academic freedom.
And how are you doing that, and is it working?
Well, I left the network, so there were quite some difficulties which have to do with the polarization in Germany, which is not as hard as in the US, but still it's stronger than 20 years before. And half a year after we started, we found that the sorry.
We'll we'll let you clear your throat, and we'll come back to you. And I will ask. Oh, okay. Yes. Sorry.
Die,
Yeah, go on.
die Frauen, sorry,
No worries. Take a break.
come
Take a
back to
break.
it.
Yeah, we will come back to you. Let me perhaps take another audience question that has come in, and this one I think to Professor Riedl. It's a French student studying between Sciences Po Bordeaux and the University of Stuttgart. And he says he has the impression that we are in an era that is now more focused on security and national interest than on transnational goals. I think picking up on what you said about programs like Choose Europe for Science being opportunities for cooperation. So he asks, with the growing tension between the US and Europe, do you see a chance that this trend will reverse, for example, by finding new transnational research cooperation in other regions like Asia?
It's a wonderful question, and I think that they are not mutually exclusive. And I would argue that the national security question is intimately connected to transnational goals, particularly in this time when transnational authoritarianism is such an incredible threat to democracy and the well-being of citizens worldwide. So to think that national security can be divorced from the kinds of transnational challenges that we face is one kind of particular way to approach it, but it's not realistic in terms of the real challenges that in the way research can contribute to national goals and transnational approaches in climate, in public health, in democracy, in the economy. All of our world is so globally interconnected. And to your point, then, that's exactly why the expansion and the collaboration across Latin America, Africa, Asia, etc., is absolutely essential. And it embodies that diversity of perspectives, approaches, and understandings that is truly, to my mind, the only way that we can approach these questions and really make progress on them in terms of our understanding.
Thank you very much. And I think Professor Lotter's throat looks clearer now, but as a person who also just had a cough and a cold, I'm very sympathetic.
Yeah.
Let me briefly go to Ned Hall because he also is working with a council on academic freedom. In this case, it's Harvard's council alone. Nonetheless, similar issues, similar goals to strike the right balance between freedom of speech and research on the one hand, and vigilance regarding language that does endanger or harm individuals on the other. How do you get that right? What are the tools, and how successful have you been so far with the council?
It's very slow working internally because what the council is focused on, along with several other initiatives at Harvard, some of which I'm involved in, is really kind of culture change from the bottom up, so that especially among students, but also among graduate students and faculty, disagreement even over topics that matter deeply to us comes to be seen as a vital resource, not as something to be avoided. And that I think part of that requires very consistent messaging about the limits on this language of harm. I think Professor Lotter and I, and probably Professor Riedl, all agree that it's been stretched kind of beyond recognition. But I think it's important not to hector students. It's much better to show students how exciting it can be to be part of a conversation where people feel free to explore ideas without fear of reprisal for what they say, and where everyone feels like, oh, if I offer something up, I won't just get ignored, right? It's very easy to have the first kind of free speech if everyone ignores each other. No, not so easy to have it combined it with a situation where everyone takes each other's contributions seriously. And the most successful efforts, I think, involve setting up situations that usually involve small groups inevitably, where the participants, and I'm thinking mainly students, feel confident enough, feel safe in a different way. Not safe in the sense that they will not encounter ideas that unsettle them, but safe in the sense that they're not worried that if they say something, it will show up on social media the next day and lead them to be ostracized by their peer group. And what I find, this is my one optimistic note, is that there's an immense appetite for this kind of interaction. It's not in any way pulling teeth to get students to engage like this. It's not like, well, you must eat your spinach. No. So you must have hard conversations. Okay, fine, if you make me. If you set the conditions right, they're all for it. I will say that I think to have a kind of long-term culture shift will require other kinds of institutional shifts. And what I'm about to say will connect back, Rachel, to the remarks you made about making transparent to the broader public the good we do. Right now, we as an institution do not prioritize those kinds of efforts. We do not incentivize directly those kinds of efforts on the part of faculty, and this really needs to come from faculty. So, for example, if I spend a ton of time innovating my teaching so that my students will learn how to have very difficult conversations in a way that's actually exciting for them, I might get a dean to pat me on the back, but it's not like if I lacked tenure, this would be a way to get it. Right. And by the same token, if I wrote the most brilliant articles about philosophical matters for a public audience, not for a scholarly audience, it's difficult to do, right? It's difficult enough to write for your peers. It's very difficult to write good scholarship in a way that brings it to life for a broader public. But if I did that very, very successfully, I could not get tenure on the basis of those kinds of publications. So honestly, that's kind of messed up. Like we have understand the importance of advancing scholarly research, but we have in the internal incentive structure tilted so far in that direction for young people that the idea that you would devote your efforts elsewhere just seems foolish to them.
Thank you very much. Let me go back to Professor Lotta now and pick up, if you would, on the question of what can those in academia do, also in Germany, to find the right balance between enabling important debate, but at the same time providing justified protection against certain kinds of perhaps threatening and harmful speech.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question if you look for practical solutions. I can only say in the Netzwerk Wissenschaftsfreiheit, we had the problem that within the Netzwerk, we had this, very soon it turned out that we had the same polarization of political opinions as outside. So what was seen as lectures or projects which had to be protected were often seen as something dangerous and problematic by other groups. So even within the network, we didn't have a consent what kind of projects and research we wanted to have protected and where to draw the limit. And this was rather frustrating and the reason why I left. But of course, it's not really the problem of the individuals. It's a social problem right now that we even seem to have two different languages within academia and in the far public. Some people use a vocabulary of vulnerability and safety to describe a landscape of moral dangers which other people just don't see. And they use the concepts very differently. And I think we have to work again to find a common language, which without stretched concepts, to be able to compromise and consent on certain problems which we all have.
Thank you. We're just about out of time, but I have one last comment that I think is a very important one, and therefore I would like to just briefly bring it in and with the request for maybe 2 sentences of response from Professor Riedl. So the comment is this, and it comes from an anonymous contributor. I don't understand why the 2 speakers were selected from the United States. They're clearly intelligent and committed, but they represent U.S. academia. Cornell and Harvard are tremendously wealthy and powerful private universities that have gotten attention from Trump but are well-resourced to respond. What about the thousands of us who teach and research at public universities, including ones in red, meaning Republican-governed states, where the government tells you exactly what you can and can't teach and research and fires people who violate the rules? A scholar who represents the experience of most American academics should also be heard. Professor Riedl?
Yes, I'm so grateful for this comment because I actually am part of several networks that meet weekly and very frequently that include faculty and administrators from every type of university imaginable. So I'm in deep conversation with these colleagues and who face threats, as the commenter mentioned, at the state level, in addition to, or sometimes instead of, attacks from the federal government, because the federal government may not be targeting those kinds of universities. So they are different types of pressures and they're coming from different places. But in effect, actually, that's why I think that the nature of how our universities are structured differently is sometimes used as a way to keep us apart. But these solidarity networks amongst faculty and administrators who are contributing to solutions, and in particular amongst alumni who make up our society and who understand the value of public universities and who benefited from them, as I did, from a public university. Are the biggest need to be the advocates for contributing to the well-being of the university. And in terms of faculty being, under threat for their curriculum and for their research, all the more reason why we have to work together in terms of our programming to do things together, in terms of our research funding to allow different types of research agendas to get the scholarly credit that they deserve and the accolades within the discipline. We are the ones who set those terms for ourselves and for each other.
Thank you very much. And I think that's a wonderful way to wrap up our discussion. What I'm hearing from all of you is that this is a difficult and ongoing struggle, and that it does require that we keep on talking, when we keep on listening, and we keep on trying to work together in ways that help to build bridges at a time when so many bridges are being torn down. So I will say thank you very, very much to all three of you for this very thoughtful and far-reaching exchange that we've had. And I would also like to thank our audience for joining us, as well as the three host organizations for making this discussion possible. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.